Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. Welcome, my friend. I've been doing something a bit different today. The last traveller who passed through here taught me the most wonderful art. It's called braiding. You take all these colourful strings and braid them together in such a way where you end up with these wonderful little ropes. I've been adding colourful stones to mine. I may just make a bowl full of them for travellers to pick the ones they like. I am Sniper Shadow and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I am always here to guide and care for the travellers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Please take a rest here before continuing on your journey. Frank wandered off into the Pokemon dimension the other day and came back with a little Bulbasaur in tow. The little guy absolutely adores Frank, and I didn't have the heart to tell him to take it back. You may have passed them when you came in. They're out playing ball in the dust, which means they're both going to need a bath later. No matter, that's a job for later. Today we continue a journey to the center of the earth by Jules Verne. Last we left our little explorers group, they were deep inside the volcanic tubes of the mountain Sneffel. Hopefully they can find their way. Let's begin, my friend. Chapter 20. The First Signs of Distress. In fact, we had to ration ourselves. Our provision of water could not last more than 3 days. I found that out for certain when supper time came, and to our sorrow we had little reason to expect to find a spring in these transition beds. The whole of the next day the gallery opened before us, its endless arcades. We moved on almost without a word. Hans's silence seemed to be infecting us. The road was now not ascending, at least not perceptibly. Sometimes even it seemed to have a slight fall. But this tendency, which was very trifling, could not do anything to reassure the professor. There was no change in the beds, and the transitional characteristics became more and more decided. The electric light was reflected in the sparkling splendor from the schist limestone and old red sandstone of its walls. It might have been thought that we were passing through a section of Wales, of which an ancient people gave its name to this system. Specimens of magnificent marble clothed the walls, and some of a greyish agate fantastically veined with white, others of rich crimson or yellow dashed with splotches of red. Then came the dark cherry-coloured marbles, relieved by the lighter tints of limestone. The greater part of these bore impressions of primitive organisms. Creation had evidently advanced since the day before. Instead of rudimentary trilobites, I noticed remains of more perfect order of beings, amongst others ganoid fishes and some of those sauroids, which paleontologists have discovered the earliest reptile forms. The Devonshire seas were peopled by animals of these species and deposited them by the thousands in the rocks of the newer formations. It was evident that we were ascending that scale of animal life in which man fills the highest place, but Professor Lidenbrock seemed not to notice it. He was awaiting one of two events, either the appearance of a vertical well opening before his feet, down which our descent might be resumed, or that of some obstacle which should effectually turn us back on our own footsteps. But evening came, and neither wish was gratified. On Friday, after a night during which I felt the first pangs of thirst, our little troop again plunged into the winding passages of the gallery. After 10 hours' walking, I observed a singular deadening of the reflection of our lamps from the side walls. The marble, the schist, the limestone, and the sandstone were giving way to a dark and lustreless lining. At one moment, the tunnel becoming very narrow, I leaned against the wall. When I removed my hand, it was black. I looked nearer, and I found we were in a coal formation. "A coal mine!" I cried. "A mine without miners," my uncle replied. "Who knows?" I asked. "I know," the professor pronounced decidedly. "I am certain that this gallery, driven through the beds of coal, was never pierced by the hand of man. But whether it be the hand of nature or not does not matter. Supper time has come. Let us sup." Hans prepared some food. I scarcely ate. and I swallowed down the few drops of water rationed out to me. One flask half full was all we had left to slake the thirst of 3 men. After their meal, my 2 companions laid themselves down upon their rugs and found in sleep a solace for their fatigue. But I could not sleep, and I counted every hour until morning. On Saturday at 6 we started afresh. In 20 minutes we reached a vast open space. I then knew that the hand of man had not hollowed out this mine. The vaults would have been shored up, and it was, they seemed to be held up by a miracle of equilibrium. This cavern was about 100 feet wide and 150 in height. A large mass had been rent asunder by the subterranean disturbance. Yielding to some vast power, from below it had broken asunder, leaving this great hollow, into which human beings were now penetrating for the first time. The whole history of the Carboniferous period was written upon these gloomy walls, and a geologist might with ease trace all its diverse phases. The beds of coal were separated by strata of sandstone or compact clays, and appeared crushed under the weight of overlaying strata. At the age of the world which preceded the secondary period, the earth was clothed with an immense vegetable forms, the product of the double influence of tropical heat and constant moisture. A vapory atmosphere surrounded the earth, still veiling the direct rays of the sun. Thence arises the conclusion that the high temperature then existing was due to some other source than the heat of the sun. Perhaps even the orb of day may not have been ready yet to play the splendid part how he acts. There were no climates as yet, and a torrid heat equal from the pole to equator was spread over the whole surface of the globe. Whence this heat? Was it from the interior of the earth? Notwithstanding the theories of Professor Lidenbrock, a violent heat did at that time brood within the body of the spheroid. Its action was felt to the very last coats of the terrestrial crust. The plants, unacquainted with the beneficent influences of the sun, yielded neither flower nor scent, but the roots drew vigorous life from the burning soil of the early days of this planet. There were but few trees. Herbaceous plants alone existed. There were tall grasses, ferns, lycopods, besides scarilia, astrophilites, and now scarce plants, but then the species might be counted by the thousands. The coal measures owe their origin to this period of profuse vegetation. The yet elastic and yielding crust of the earth obeyed the fluid forces beneath. Thence innumerable fissures and depressions. The plants sunk underneath the waters, formed by degrees into vast accumulated masses. Then came the chemical action of nature. In the depths of the sea, vegetable accumulations first became peat, then acted upon by generated gases and the heat of fermentation, they underwent a process of complete mineralization. Thus were formed those immense coal fields, which nevertheless are not inexhaustible, and which 3 centuries at present accelerated the rate of consumption will exhaust, unless industrial world devises a remedy. These reflections came into my mind whilst I was contemplating the mineral wealth stored up in this portion of the globe. These, no doubt, I thought, will never be discovered. The working of such deep mines would involve too large an outlay, and where would the use be as long as coal yet spread far and wide near the surface? Such as my eyes behold these virgin stores, such they will be when this world comes to an end. But still we marched on, and I alone was forgetting the length of the way by losing myself in the midst of geological contemplations. The temperature remained what it had been during our passage through the lava and schists. Only my sense of smell was forcibly affected by an odor of protocarbonate of hydrogen. I immediately recognized in this gallery the presence of quite a considerable quantity of the dangerous gas called by miners fire damp, the explosion of which has often occurred in such dreadful catastrophes. Happily, our light was from Ruhmkorff's ingenious apparatus. If unfortunately we had explored this gallery with torches, a terrible explosion would have put an end to travelling and travellers at one stroke. This excursion through the coal mine lasted till night. My uncle scarcely could restrain his impatience at the horizontal road. The darkness, always deep 20 yards before us, prevented us from estimating the length of the gallery, and I was beginning to think it must be endless, when suddenly at 6 o'clock a wall very unexpectedly stood before us. Right or left, top or bottom, there was no road farther, and we were at an end of a blind alley. "Very well, that's all right," cried my uncle. "Now at any rate we shall know what we are about. We are not in Skinnasam's road, and all we have to do is go back. Let us take a night's rest, and in 3 days we shall get to the fork in the road." "Yes," said I, "if we have any strength left." "Why not?" "Because tomorrow we shall have no water." "Nor courage either?" my uncle asked severely. I dared make no answer. Chapter 21. Compassion fuses the Professor's heart. Next day we started early. We had to hasten forwards. It was 3 days' march back to the crossroads. I will not speak of the sufferings we endured in our return. My uncle bore them with the angry impatience of a man obliged to his own weakness. Hans with the resignation of his passive nature. I confess, with complaints and expressions of despair. I had no spirit to oppose this ill fortune. As I had foretold, the water failed entirely by the end of the first day's retrograde march. Our fluid ailment was now nothing but gin, but this infernal fluid burned my throat, and I could not even endure the sight of it. I found the temperature and the air stifling. Fatigue paralyzed my limbs. More than once I dropped down motionless. Then there was a halt, and my uncle and the Icelander did their best to restore me. But I saw that the former was struggling painfully against excessive fatigue and the tortures of thirst. At last, on Tuesday, 8th of July, we arrived on our hands and knees and half dead at the junction of the two roads. There I dropped like a lifeless lump, extended on the lava soil. It was 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, clinging to the wall, tried to nibble a few bits of biscuit. Long moans escaped from my swollen lips. After some time my uncle approached me and raised me in his arms. "Poor boy," said he, in genuine tones of compassion. I was touched with these words, not being accustomed to see the excitable Professor in a softened mood. I grasped his trembling hands in mine. He let me hold them and looked at me. His eyes were moistened. Then I saw him take the flask that was hanging at his side. To my amazement, he placed it on my lips. "Drink," he said. Had I heard him? Was my uncle beside himself? I stared at him stupidly. I felt as if I could not understand him. "Drink!" he said again, and raising his flask, he emptied it, every drop, between my lips. Oh, infinite pleasure! A slender slip of water came to moisten my burning mouth. It was but one sip, but it was enough to recall my ebbing life. I thanked my uncle with clasped hands. "Yes," he said, "a draught of water, but it is the very last, you hear, the last." I had kept it as a precious treasure at the bottom of my flask. 20 times, nay 100 times, I have fought against a frightful impulse to drink it off. But no, Axel, I kept it for you. "My dear uncle," I said, whilst hot tears trickled down my face. "Yes, my poor boy. I knew that as soon as you arrived at these crossroads you would drop half dead, and I kept my last drop of water to reanimate you." "Thank you, thank you," I said, although my thirst was only partially quenched. Yet some strength had returned. The muscles of my throat, then contracted, now relaxed again, and the inflammation of my lips abated somewhat, and I was now able to speak. "Let us see," I said. "We have now but one thing to do. We have no water. We must go back." Whilst I spoke, my uncle avoided looking at me. He hung his head down. His eyes avoided mine. "We must return!" I exclaimed vehemently. "We must go back, on our way to Sneffels. May God give us the strength to climb up the crater again." "Return!" my uncle said, he rather as if he was answering himself than me. "Yes, return, without the loss of a minute." A long silence followed. "So then, Axel," replied the Professor ironically, "you have found no courage or energy in these few drops of water?" "Courage?" "I see you are just as feeble-minded as you were before, and still expressing only despair." What sort of man was this I had to do with, and what schemes was he now resolving in his fearless mind? What? You won't go back?
Should I renounce this expedition just when we have the fairest chance of success? Never.
Then we must resign ourselves to destruction.
No, Axel, no. Go back. Hans will go with you. Leave me to myself.
Leave you here?
Leave me. I tell you, I have undertaken this expedition, and I will carry it out to the end, and I will not return. Go, Axel, go.
My uncle, in his high state of excitement, his voice, which had for a moment been tender and gentle, had now become hard and threatening. He was struggling with gloomy resolutions against impossibilities. I would not leave him to this bottomless abyss, and on the other hand, the instinct of self-preservation prompted me to fly. Guide watched this scene with his usual phlegmatic unconcern. Yet he understood perfectly well what was going on between his two companions. The gestures themselves were sufficient enough to show that we were each bent on taking a different road, but Hans seemed to take no part in a question upon which depended his life. He was ready to start at a given signal, or to stay if his master so willed it. I drew near Hans. I placed my hand upon his. He made no movement. My parted lips sufficiently revealed my sufferings. The Icelander slowly moved his head, and calmly pointing to my uncle, said,
Master.
"Master!" I shouted. "You madman! No, he is not the master of our life. We must fly. We must drag him. Do you hear me? Do you understand?" I seized Hans by the arm. I wished to oblige him to rise. I strove with him. My uncle interposed.
Be calm, Axel. You will get nothing from that immovable servant. Therefore, listen to my proposal.
I crossed my arms and confronted my uncle boldly.
The want of water, he said, is the only obstacle in our way. This eastern gallery is made up of lavas, schist, and coal. We have not met with a single particle of moisture. Perhaps we shall be more fortunate if we follow the western tunnel.
I shook my head incredulously.
Hear me to the end, the professor said with a firm voice. Whilst you were lying there motionless, I went to examine the conformation of that gallery. It penetrates directly downwards, and in a few hours will bring us to the granite rocks. There we must meet with abundant springs. The nature of rock has assured me of this, and the instinct agrees with logic to support my conviction. Now this is my proposal. When Columbus asked of his ship's crews for 3 days more to discover a new world, those crews, disheartened and sick as they were, recognized the justice of the claim, and he discovered America. I am the Columbus of this netherworld, and I only ask for 1 more day. If in a single day we have not met with water that we want, I will swear to you that we will return to the surface of the earth.
In spite of my irritation, I was moved with these words, as well as with the violence my uncle was doing to his own wishes in making so hazardous a proposal. "Well," I said, "do as you will, and God reward your superhuman energy. You have now but a few hours to tempt fortune. Let us start." Chapter 22. Total Failure of Water. This time the descent commenced by a new gallery. Hans walked first, as was his custom. We had not gone 100 yards when the professor, moving his lantern along the walls, cried,
"Here are primitive rocks. Now we are in the right way. Forward!"
When in its early stages the earth was slowly cooling, the contraction gave rise to its crust to disruptions, distortions, fissures, and chasms. The passage through which we were moving was such a fissure, through which at one time granite poured out in a molten state, its thousands of winding forms inextricable labyrinth through the primeval mass. As fast as we descended, the succession of beds forming the primitive foundation came out with increasing distinctness. Geologists consider this primitive matter to be the base of the mineral crust of the earth, and have ascertained it to be composed of 3 different formations: schists, gneiss, and mica schists, resting upon an unchangeable foundation, the granite. Never had mineralogists found themselves in so marvelous a situation to study nature in situ. What the boring machine and insensible inert instrument was unable to bring to the surface of the inner structure of the globe, we were able to peruse with our own eyes and handle it with our own hands. Through the beds of schist, coloured with delicate shades of green, ran in winding course of threads copper and manganese with traces of platinum and gold. I thought, what riches are here, buried at an unapproachable depth in the earth, hidden for ever from covetous eyes of the human race. These treasures had been buried at such profound depth by the convulsions and primeval times that they run no chance of ever being molested by the pickaxe or the spade. To the schist succeeded the gneiss, partially stratified, remarkable for the parallelism and the regularity of its lamina, then the mica schists, laid in large plates or flakes, revealing their lamellated structure by the sparkle of white shining mica. The light from our apparatus reflected the small facets of quartz, shot sparkling rays at every angle, and I seemed to be moving through a diamond, within which quickly darting rays broke across each other in 1,000 flashing concentrations. At about 6 o'clock, this brilliant fete of illuminations underwent a sensible abatement of splendor, then almost ceased. The walls assumed a crystallized, though sombre appearance. Mica was more closely mingled with the feldspar and the quartz to form the proper rocky foundations of the earth, which bears without distortion all the crushing weight of the 4 terrestrial systems. We were immured within prison walls of granite. It was 8 in the evening. No signs of water had yet appeared. I was suffering horribly. My uncle strode on. He refused to stop. He was listening anxiously for the murmur of distant springs. But no, there was dead silence. And now my limbs were failing beneath me. I resisted pain and torture that I might not stop my uncle, which would have driven him to despair, for the day was drawing near to its end, and it was his last. At last I failed utterly. I uttered a cry, and fell. "Come to me! I am dying!" My uncle retraced his steps. He gazed upon me with his arms crossed. Then these muttered words passed his lips: "It is all over." The last thing I saw was the fearful gesture of rage, and my eyes closed. When I reopened them, I saw my 2 companions motionless and rolled up in their coverings. Were they asleep? As for me, I could not get one moment's sleep. I was suffering too keenly, and what embittered my thoughts was that there was no remedy. My uncle's last words echoed painfully in my ears: "It is all over." For in such a fearful state of debility it was madness to think of ever reaching the upper world again. We had above us 1.5 leagues of terrestrial crust. The weight of it seemed to be crushing down upon my shoulders. I felt weighted down, and I exhausted myself with imaginary violent exertions to turn around upon the granite couch. A few hours passed away. A deep silence reigned around us, the silence of the grave. No sound could reach us through the walls, the thinnest of which were 5 miles thick. Yet in the midst of my stupefaction I seemed to be aware of a noise. It was dark down the tunnel, but I seemed to see the Icelander vanishing from our sights with a lamp in his hand. Why was he leaving us? Was Hans going to forsake us? My uncle was fast asleep. I wanted to shout, but my voice died upon my parched lips. The darkness became deeper, and the last sound died away in the far distance. "Hans has abandoned us!" I cried. "Hans! Hans!" But these words were only spoken within me. They went no farther. Yet after a moment of terror I felt ashamed of suspecting a man of such extraordinary faithfulness. Instead of ascending, he was descending the gallery. An evil design would have taken him up, not down. This reflection restored me to calmness, and I turned to other thoughts. None but some weighty motive could have induced so quiet a man to forfeit his sleep. Was he on a journey of discovery? Had he during the silence of the night caught a sound, a murmuring of something in the distance, which had failed to affect my hearing? Chapter 23. Water Discovered. For a whole hour I was trying to work out in my delirious brain the reasons which might have influenced this seemingly tranquil huntsman. The absurdest notions ran in utter confusion through my mind. I thought madness was coming on. But at last a noise of footsteps was heard in the dark abyss. Hans was approaching. A flickering light was beginning to glimmer on the wall of our darksome prison. Then it came out full at the mouth of the gallery. Hans appeared. He drew close to my uncle, laid his hand upon his shoulder, and gently woke him. My uncle rose up.
"What's the matter?" he asked. "Watan!" replied the huntsman.
No doubt, under the inspiration of intense pain, everybody becomes endowed with the gift of diverse tongues. I did not know a word of Danish, yet instinctively I understood the word he had uttered. "Water! Water!" I recried, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman.
"Water," repeated my uncle. "Hvar?" he asked in Icelandic. "Net," replied Hans. "Where? Down below." I understood it all.
I seized the hunter's hands and pressed them, while he looked on with me without moving a muscle of his countenance. The preparations for our departure were not long in making, and we were soon on our way down a passage inclining 2 feet in 7. In an hour we had gone 1 mile and a quarter, and descended 2,000 feet. Then I began to hear distinctly quite a new sound of something running within the thickness of the granite wall, a kind of dead, dull rumbling, like distant thunder. During the first part of our walk, not meeting with the promised spring, I felt my agony returning, but then my uncle acquainted me with the cause of the strange noise.
"Hans was not mistaken," he said. "What you hear is the rushing of a torrent."
"A torrent!" I exclaimed.
"There can be no doubt. A subterranean river is flowing around us."
We hurried forwards in the greatest excitement. I was no longer sensible of my fatigue. This murmuring of waters close at hand was already refreshing me. It was audibly increasing. The torrent, after having some time flowed over our heads, was now running within the left wall, roaring and rushing. I frequently touched the wall, hoping to feel some indications of moisture, but there was no hope here. Yet another half an hour, another half league was passed. Then it became clear that the hunter had gone no farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to mountaineers, he had, as it were, felt this torrent through the rock, but he had certainly seen none of the precious liquid. He had drunk nothing himself. Soon it became evident that if we continued our walk we should widen the distance between ourselves and the stream, the noise of which was becoming fainter. We returned. Hans stopped where the torrent seemed closest. I sat near the wall, while the waters were flowing past me at a distance of 2 feet with extreme violence. But there was a thick granite wall between us and the object of our desires. Without reflection, without asking if there were any means of procuring the water, I gave way to a movement of despair. Hans glanced at me with, I thought, a smile of compassion. He rose and took the lamp. I followed him. He moved towards the wall. I looked on. He applied his ear against the dry stone, and moved it slowly to and fro, listening intently. I perceived at once that he was examining to find the exact place where the torrent could be heard the loudest. He met with that point on the left side of the tunnel, at 3 feet from the ground. I was stirred up with excitement. I hardly dared guess what the hunter was about to do, but I could not but understand, and applaud and cheer him on, when I saw him lay hold of the pickaxe, to make an attack upon the rock. "We are saved!" I cried.
"Yes," cried my uncle with almost frantic excitement. "Hans is right. Capital fellow. Who but he would have thought of it?"
Yes, who but he, such an expedient, however simple, would have never entered into our minds. True, it seemed most hazardous to strike a blow of a hammer in this part of the earth's structure. Suppose some displacement should occur and crush us all? Suppose the torrent bursting through should drown us in a sudden flood? There was nothing vain in these fancies, but still no fears of falling rocks or rushing floods could save us now. Our thirst was so intense that to satisfy it we would have dared the waves of the North Atlantic. Hans set about the task which my uncle and I together could not have accomplished. If our impatience had armed our hands with power, we should have shattered the rock into 1,000 fragments. Not so Hans. Full of self-possession, he calmly wore his way through the rock, with a steady succession of light and skilful strokes, working through an aperture 6 inches wide at the outside. I could hear a louder noise of flowing waters, and I fancied I could feel the delicious fluid refreshing my parched lips. The pick had soon penetrated 2 feet into the granite partition, and our man had worked for above an hour. I was in an agony of impatience. My uncle wanted to employ stronger measures, and I had some difficulty dissuading him. Still, he had just taken a pickaxe in his hand when the hissing was heard, and a jet of water spurted out with violence against the opposite wall. Hans, almost thrown off his feet by the violence of the shock, uttered a cry of grief and disappointment, of which I soon understood the cause, when, plunging my hand into the spouting torrent, I withdrew them in haste, for the water was scalding hot. "The water is at boiling point," I cried.
"Well, never mind. Let it cool," my uncle replied.
The tunnel was filling with steam, whilst a steam was forming, which by degrees wandered away into subterranean windings, and soon we had the satisfaction of swallowing our first draught. Could anything be more delicious than the sensation that our burning, intolerable thirst was passing away, and leaving us to enjoy the comfort and pleasure? But where was this water from? No matter. It was water, and though still warm, it brought life back to the dying. I kept drinking without stopping, and almost without tasting. After last a most delightful time of reviving energy, I cried, "Why, this is a child of beet spring!"
"Nothing could be better for the digestion," said my uncle. "It is highly impregnated with iron. It will be good for us as going to the spa or the toplets."
"Well, it is delicious."
"Of course it is. Water should be, found 6 miles underground. It has an inky flavour which is not all unpleasant. What a capital source of strength Hans has found for us here. We will call it after its name."
"Agreed!" I cried.
And Hansbach it was from that moment.
Hans was none the prouder. After a moderate draught, he went quietly into a corner to rest. "Now," I said, "we must not lose this water."
"What is the use of troubling ourselves?" my uncle replied. "I fancy it will never fail."
"Never mind, we cannot be sure. Let us fill our water bottles and our flasks, then stop up the opening." My advice was followed so far as getting in a supply, but the stopping up of the hole was not so easy to accomplish. It was in vain that we took up fragments of granite and stuffed them in with tow. We only scalded our hands without succeeding. The pressure was too great, and our efforts were fruitless. "It is quite the plan," said I, "that a higher body of this water at considerable elevation, the force of the jet shows that."
"No doubt," answered my uncle. "If this column of water is 32,000 feet high, that is, from the surface of the earth, it is equal to the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. But I have got an idea."
"Well?"
"Why should we trouble ourselves to stop up the stream from coming out at all?"
"Because—" well, I could not assign a reason.
"When our flasks are empty, where shall we fill them again? Can we tell that?"
No, there was no certainty.
"Well, then let us allow the water to run on. It will flow, and it will both guide and refresh us."
"That is well planned," I cried. "With the stream for our guide, there is no reason why we should not succeed in our undertaking."
"Aha! My boy, you agree with me now," cried the Professor, laughing.
"I agree with you most heartily."
"Well, let us rest awhile, and then we will start again."
I was forgetting that it was night. The chronometer soon informed me of that fact, and in a very short time, refreshed and thankful, we all three fell into a sound sleep. That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week, and we will continue our journey through A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. If you wish to rest some more, please find a space that suits you, whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden. Please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you are continuing your journey, the multiverse has some treats for you today. To the north, time to battle your way through bizarre planets in search of an alien artifact in order to unlock your true potential. Attack, react, and smash your way through figuring out the order of the universe. To the west, love plants? Great, you've come to the right place. Time to become the ultimate botanist, and what better way than running your own plant shop filled with wacky and exotic plants. You've got plants coming out of your ears and a set of whimsical clientele to keep you busy. Better get digging. To the east, Quick, the town is under siege, Brad. It's time to get your loot? Use music to soothe the souls of your enemies and help Brad achieve his dreams of being a musician in this adorable little world of chaos and cuteness. And if you are making your own way out there, good luck, my friend, wherever you end up. Wherever you come from and wherever you're going, thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.